In this video, we will show you how to replace your front brakes, pads, and rotors on this two-wheel drive Ford Ranger. A quick note, you will have to remove the seal along the backside to remove your wheel bearings, so make sure you have a brand new one for each side of your vehicle. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Once you've done so, we're going to continue on to removing the center cover, the 19mm lug nuts, and the wheel. Let's continue on to pushing in our two caliper pistons. On this particular caliper, it will have a piston along the bottom and the top. To push those back, we can easily use a pry bar. Carefully come in between these slots and pry up against the rotor. This should push back each one of those pistons just enough that we can continue on from there. Once you have those two pistons pushed back as far as you can, we'll continue on with our two caliper slider pin bolts. You'll be using a 13mm for each of these. We'll loosen up the top one first. Once we have that loose, we'll continue on with fully removing the bottom. That one's nice and loose. Inspect your mounting hardware as you remove it. Replace as necessary. Once you have both of those bolts out of there, you should be able to take hold of the caliper, give it a wiggle, and remove it from the area. You could carefully use a pry bar. Once you have the caliper out of place, we'll be continuing on to paying attention to each of the two caliper pistons. You need to ensure that they're pushed back in fully and there's no leak. If you see any fluid coming along the seal, typically that means that there's an issue with the seal itself and you will have to replace the caliper. To push in your caliper pistons, you want to do them at the same time. With that said, we'll be using an old brake pad. Now we can continue on by pressing this in, and that'll press in both of those pistons. Let's use a caliper compression tool here. Make sure it's going the right way. There we are. Now we can set this aside, putting no pressure on our flex hose. Let's continue on to removing our brake pads from the area. Ours are frozen in the bracket. When you remove your brake pads, it's a good idea to give them a quick inspection. Make sure it doesn't look like they're worn at an angle. That could tell us we're having an issue with the caliper. This one looks fine. We'll set it aside. This one out of here. Let's remove our two caliper bracket bolts. There's one out in the open and the other one's just behind the knuckle. Use a 15mm for these. We'll leave that bolt in there just a couple threads for now. Remove your caliper bracket and set it aside. In the center of the rotor, you're going to find that you have a small cover. We'll have to pop this out of place. You can do that using pliers or even a tool that looks like this. Now, once you pop that out of place, it's important to give it a close inspection. Make sure it's not damaged. You will be reusing this. Go ahead and clean it up and set it aside. Once you have that out of the way, let's continue on with some cutters. Typically, you will find that you have a locking cotter pin in this area. Go ahead and take that right out of there. It's a good idea to replace these. Now, once you have that out of the way, you should be able to remove this area. As you can tell, this has a whole bunch of slots making its way around. This is what holds the nut in place. There's a small hole that goes through the spindle that goes straight up and down for that locking cotter pin. You want to make sure this is still in good reusable condition. Now we can start removing our 1 1/16 nut. You can use a wrench or some pliers for this. Now, once you start loosening this, you do want to pay attention to the fact that the rotor will come loose at this point. Make sure you're holding onto the rotor so it does not potentially fall off and hurt you once you have removed that mounting nut and washer. At this point, there should be a washer located just behind the nut. And then inside the front of the rotor, that's where you're going to find the outside wheel bearing. That's the smaller of the two. At this point, we'll carefully slide the brake rotor out of place, and we can have a look along the backside. Let's bring this over to the bench so we can remove the seal and the bearing from the backside. Now, with this on the bench, we're going to start removing the seal from this area. You could use a pry bar and carefully make your way down under here at an angle and gently pry it up using leverage. Otherwise, you could just use a seal remover tool. Not everybody has one of these. Like I said, you could just use a pry bar. As we start pulling this out, we want to be careful not to get hurt. We'll just gently pry it up and out of place. There's the original seal. We can set this aside to dispose of it. We can reach in here, remove that inner bearing. Now at this point, the next thing that you will want to do is clean and inspect each of your bearings. Use some parts cleaner for this. You want to ensure that you don't see any scoring and you don't want to see any burnt marks on these. If you do happen to see odd coloring, typically that means that your bearing has overheated and you should replace it. We'll check the outer bearing as well real quick. At this point, we'll wash both of these down and give them a thorough inspection. Now that we have those clean, we'll just give them a quick inspection. As you can tell, these are reusable. At this point, it's time to pack the wheel bearings. You want to make sure that you have grease inside of the center areas on each one of the bearings themselves. Now, looking at each of these, you can tell they have a whole bunch of little roller bearings that make their way all the way across, and you can see that groove. It's a little difficult to pack grease inside there. Typically, if you were to put grease on the gloved palm of your hand, you could take the bearing and gently start forcing it in, just like this. Just roll it right in. Otherwise, we'll be continuing on with a bearing packing tool. Take each one of the bearings and try to center it as close as possible. I'm going to start with the inboard one, which is the larger of the two, and then the outboard one, which is the smaller. Once you have that in place, we can continue on with the driver. This will press right down up against that area of the bearing. Once we press this down, the grease will start making its way up in between all of these areas. I'm just going to turn this in here, bring it down. There we are. Make sure this is pressed in. Now, as you can see, looking inside through the clear plastic, I can see grease made its way up and through that bearing. We'll just confirm that real quick by pulling this out of place. Remove as much of this extra grease as possible. We don't really need too much. Wow. Looking inside there, I can tell that both of these bearings are completely packed the way that they need to be. That's perfect. Looking along the back of the rotor, I'm going to take my gloved finger with some grease on it and lubricate each of these areas. We have the race, right where the inner bearing is going to go, and then you have the outer bearing deep on the inside there. That one's a little bit hard to gain access to from this side, but that's okay. We'll pause there and continue on with that inner bearing. Go ahead and take this and put it in place. Once you have that in place, continue on to removing the excess grease. Here's where we're going to continue on with our seal. Go ahead and take that seal and put it in place up against the brake rotor. We're trying to align it as close as possible. Continue on with a steel driver, pressing it down as flat as possible until it's completely bottomed out against the brake rotor. We'll just double check all the way around this. Assuming you're completely seated all the way around, continue on to turning the brake rotor over. At this point, with the glove finger, we'll add some lubricant in the forward port here, right along that race where your bearing's going to go. Now that we have this lubricated, let's pause on the brake rotor itself and make our way back over to the vehicle. Now on the vehicle itself, we'll be paying attention to the stud that comes out of here. Just use a rag, go ahead and give this a quick wipe. We want to ensure that it is still in good working order. It's not rotted or damaged in any way. Once you've cleaned this portion, it's important to make your way all the way up into this area. This is where the seal will sit. You want to ensure that it's clean and free of any debris and it's not grooved in any way that moisture might make its way into where the bearings are and potentially cause serious damage. Wipe down that mounting hardware here. You have the nut, the washer, and you should also have the locking castle washer. Just make sure these are still in good working order. Yeah. At this point, we can continue on to installing the brake rotor. When doing so, we'll have a look along the back side. Take a little bit of that grease and we'll just lubricate along the seal. Continue on to sliding this into place. As you bring this into position, make sure that you hold onto the brake rotor at all times so it does not potentially fall off and hurt you or get damaged. We'll take some more grease and pack it directly into the hole here. It's always good to have a little extra. That way there, once it heats up, it can work its way into the bearing. Careful for any pinch points. There we are. Continue on to your bearing. Next thing after that will be the washer and then the nut. At this point, I'm going to bottom it out by hand. We'll continue on by cleaning this up a little bit, and then we can make our wheel bearing adjustment. Now to make this adjustment, we'll be using our 1 1/16 wrench. We're going to have to take hold of the rotor, and we'll be spinning it at the same time as we attempt to snug the nut. Now when I'm doing this, you can tell that I'm not putting very much pressure on this, but every time that I did spin it and attempt to bottom it out, the wrench continued moving further and further clockwise, continuing to tighten. We don't want to over tighten this and cause damage to the bearings, but you do need to ensure that there is not any movement. At this point, I'll take hold of the rotor, try to give it a little wiggle. We're feeling for any movement. Assuming that's good, let's continue on to the locking clip and cotter pin. Once you feel as though you have the slots aligned, we'll get that cotter pin in there. Pin it in so you're sure there is no way this axle nut can loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Now it's time for our protective cover. Now once again, we do need to make sure we have a good seal, so we want to ensure that nothing can make its way into this area and cause contamination. Use some gasket maker to prevent anything making its way in. Now we can tap this into place. Over on the bench, we'll continue on disassembling the caliper bracket. On the caliper bracket, you're going to find that you have 2 caliper slider pins. Each one of these pins should have a boot. The boot itself could be on the pin or on the caliper bracket. Either way, you do want to separate it and give it a quick inspection. As for the boot here, just wipe this out from the inside. Thorough inspection, make sure it is still pliable. Once you've done that, the next thing you'll want to do is clean and inspect the slider pins. When you're cleaning the pins, it's important to make sure you inspect the shafted area, but you also want to make your way down into where that boot should ride. If there's an issue here, there's a possibility you might have an issue with the slider pin. Assuming that looks good, go ahead and set it aside and do the same to the other. A lot of rust on that one. You may find that you have a vibration dampener on one of your slider pins. Make sure that you clean that, inspect it, and remount it in the same port that you had removed it. I'm going to have to clean all this up and make my way up in here. At this point, I've confirmed that all of this looks good. We can set it aside. We'll continue on back at the bracket itself. As for the bracket, you should find that you have shims along each side. Typically for these, you can take hold of them and pull them out of place. There should be one on this side. The process is the same. Ours is missing. The next thing we'll have to do is clean up the bracket itself. Looking at the bracket, you want to make sure you clean the areas that had the 2 tins and the 2 slider ports. To clean up the areas with the tins, you could use some sandpaper or wire brush. Now that we've cleaned all 4 of those edges, we'll move along to talking about the slider ports. You have the outer portion here where the boot will sit, and you also have the area where the slider will go in and out of. We'll want to make sure that those areas are clean. As for out here, just use a small screwdriver or pick and break free any of the rust or debris. Once you've made your way around there, make your way inside the port. We'll use parts cleaner and a bore brush for this. Now that we've cleaned this side, we'll do the same to the other port. Give the caliper bracket a quick inspection, and at this point, we can continue on with some high-temperature caliper lubricant. Take the high-temperature lubricant and lubricate the entire shaft all the way up to where my fingers are. We want to make sure we get into the groove where the boot is. We'll use that lubricant right along the bracket, a little bit in the port. Continue on with your boot. We'll slide that into place onto the slider pin. Press it up onto that groove. Install the slider pin into the port. Go ahead and press that in and double check to make sure the boot is completely seated all the way around. Just clean up our mess in this area. Quick confirmation. And a quick confirmation. Do the same to the other slider pin. The next thing we'll do is continue on to those 4 areas on the caliper bracket that we had cleaned. We'll be using the high temperature lubricant in this area. It's time to install the tins. We'll take these and put them into position. You want to press them onto the caliper bracket as far as possible and lock them in. Get the other one on here. All right, let's get this in the vehicle. Carefully take that bracket and slide it over the brake rotor. Once you have that aligned, we'll take our 2 mounting bolts, start them in position, snug them up, and torque them to 85 foot-pounds. The next thing we'll do is continue on to our brake pads. We'll take each of these and slide them into position. If it feels as though they don't slide in easily, you may have to continue cleaning your bracket. Double check to make sure they can move around freely, and then you can continue on with your caliper. Before you reinstall the caliper, the next thing you'll want to do is apply some high temperature lubricant to each one of your caliper pistons and the backside of each of the 3 ears. Doing this will help with vibration dampening and noise reduction overall. Now we can take the caliper and put it in place, being careful not to twist our flex hose. Let's continue on with our 2 caliper slider bolts. Start them in, snug them up, torque them to 27 foot-pounds. We'll just double check that flex hose before we move away from this point. Before we continue on to reinstalling the wheel, let's just have one last look at everything. You want to confirm that you do have this sealed, the flex hose is not twisted, and everything's back together torqued as it should be. Let's take that wheel and put it in position. Start on all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts, we'll bottom them out, get the wheel safely back on the ground, and we can torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Now that we have this on the ground, we'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. If you had a center cover, go ahead and install that now. Looking along the backside, you're going to find the area for each one of your lug nuts to fit into. Go ahead and align that and tap it into place. Okay friends, we've got our vehicle together. At this point, the process for one side of the vehicle is the exact same thing as the other. After you've completed that, go ahead into the passenger compartment, pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Take your vehicle for a road test, listen for funny noises. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.